Why is an Inspector Calls set in 1912 and not 1945? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Giles Goff. I'm education writer and a recovering English teacher, and today we're going to be looking at the context of an Inspector Calls. Let's get into it. So, first of all, let's get into the basics. England in 1912, some key things to think about here, okay? Middle class women wouldn't work, but working class women would be forced to work, often in poor conditions for very low pay. This is explicit in the way somebody like Sheila is versus the way Eva Smith is. That's nice and straightforward. And trade unions were violently put down by their employers. The fact that Mr. Burling just dismisses Eva Smith rather than anything even worse happening to her almost shows him as being, frankly, a little bit nicer than some of the other other bosses in the way they treated trade unions. There was no NHS or welfare system. That's not going to exist until the Labour government come in after the Second World War, around 1945. Women were not allowed to vote. So in 1912, you've got another 6 years before women are allowed to vote, and even on top of that, it's then 10 years after that before they're allowed to vote on the same terms as men. And there's incredibly strong distinctions between classes at this time. A lot of today's society, the whole idea is about being able to sort of better yourself and sort of come up from nothing and be an absolute millionaire if you wanted to. In this world, if you're born poor, you are very distinctly going to die poor. And the ruling classes saw no need to change the status quo because why would they? It's all working fine for them. So this is that, like I say, those are the basics. That's what I would call like your level 4 kind of things. If you drop that in there, an examiner would be able to go, yep, okay, we've got a little bit of reference to context. Let's dig a little deeper. So the setting of an Inspector Calls is in 1912 in a fictional industrial town in the North Midlands called Brumley. So for our international viewers at this point, there is no actual town called Brumley. It doesn't exist. But there's something else going on with the name there. Let's break it down, okay? What does the name Brumley actually sound like? So first of all, Brumley sounds a bit like Burnley, and Brum is a nickname for Birmingham. So you can tell that Priestley is deliberately kind of blurring what some of the local towns are. Now, obviously, Burnley, you're quite into the northwest, and Birmingham is right smack bang in the Midlands. So North Midlands, it's like he's kind of splitting the difference between the two, if you like. And the question I always find myself thinking is, why has Priestley chosen to set it in a fictional town? So around this time, broadly speaking, there's a big push for writers to kind of go up north and see how grim it is and record their experiences. The north part of England is still very industrialised at this point. And a good example would be George Orwell wrote The Road to Wigan Pier at this point. So the idea that the north is this sort of grim, bleak place is something that's kind of, we're seeing it perpetuated throughout a lot of fiction at this time. And well, not just fiction, non-fiction as well. But my thinking for this about why has he set it in a particular fictional town is, if you set it in a specific place, let's say London, then viewers can look at this and say, oh, well, yeah, those people, the Burlings, people who live in London, they're always very selfish and self-involved, aren't they? People in London definitely think like this. People in London have no idea what it's like to be poor on this sort of thing. Obviously, that's not true. That's not what I believe. But if you put it in a specific place, it means you could then have these kind of local, regional divisions, if you like. And it allows audience members to kind of let themselves off the hook. They don't have to look at themselves and think, how could I be better? What could I do differently? They can just say, oh, well, people in that town are the specific problem. That's my theory anyway. Now let's narrow down the time frame a little bit. So The play, right in the play notes, it says spring 1912, but we can actually narrow it down a little bit more than that. The play is set somewhere between April the 1st and April the 7th, 1912. Now, why do I think that? Well, Mr. Burling says, "Why, a friend of mine went over this new liner last week, the Titanic. She sails next week." So, with that in mind, assuming that we're talking about him setting sail not from Belfast, where it was made, but from Southampton on the 10th of April, then the play has to take place the week before, between the 1st and the 7th of April 1912. I do wonder about the setting it just before the Titanic. The Titanic is going to be one of those things that people are going to remember, I would say forever, but like pretty much, yeah, forever. You know, it's gone beyond living memory. And there are certain things that have happened in the world that certain generations will always remember where they were. For me, it is 9/11 and seeing the Twin Towers come down. You can ask any millennial or Gen X where they were when that happened, and they'll be able to tell you. Going back to my kind of grandparents or my parents' generation, it will be, where were you when you found out that Kennedy was killed, this sort of thing. So the idea is that after this particular time, things were terrible, but if you have enough nostalgia in you, you can believe that things before this horrendous event happened were great, when obviously they weren't, but that's how nostalgia works. And there's the crucial question, why is it set in 1912 rather than 1945? Well, putting it just before World War II was Priestley's original plan, but the play set in 1912, just 2 years before the outbreak of World War I, and it's seen as a time of peace and security in Britain. There's no financial depression or major wars. The Boer War has happened around a decade before, if not longer than that. I'm not an expert on the Boer War, but it's not a time where people look back on and see it as being really miserable. It's like nowadays, commentators will look back on the 1990s and see it as a time of peace and stability comparatively to where we are now. So it's that kind of vibe. And it also allows for dramatic irony for Mr. Burling. Now, I know we've talked about this, about there being dramatic irony, and we get that with the Mr. Burling section, where he can kind of talk about all these things, whereas if you do it from just within 5 years, you've got less things to go on. The time frame becomes more localized, and it would start to lose a bit of resonance. But is there another reason why he's doing it? And here's my idea. Many of you might be familiar with the Treaty of Versailles. And some people, a lot of historians for that matter, believe that part of the reason World War II happened was because of the Treaty of Versailles. This was created just after the First World War, and it set conditions for Germany's surrender. Now, this was a really harsh treaty. In fact, it put pretty much all the responsibility for World War I on Germany. And that's frankly not the case. There was an arms race on all sides. We'd released the Dreadnought ship at that point, and there's a gradual build-up of tension on all sides. But Germany lost, so everybody's like, well, Germany started it, which isn't strictly the case. So they're expected to pay a huge amounts of reparations. That's money going to other countries to sort of pay for the war effort, basically. And this absolutely decimates German economy. They are restricted in the number of the size of their military. They have these punishing economic restrictions on them, and resentment grows and it builds, and we have seen what it's like when dangerous thinkers like Adolf Hitler grow in popularity. So Priestley's message of this is he's very aware that history can repeat itself. After all, Germany was now occupied by multiple countries, so because of this, an inspector calls what happens if you mistreat the people around you, and how this locks you into a cycle of pain and unhappiness. If you want to get the idea of history repeating, the fact that we've got a World War I and World War II re-emphasizes this idea of a cyclical nature of history. And it would have been incredibly prevalent in Priestley's mind at this time, because if you're thinking that at some point we're locked into this cycle of building up for World War III, well, now the world has nuclear weapons. So a third world war could be the last war. It could be the end of civilization. And that's possibly what's pushing him forward at this point. So there we go. Is there anything crucial we missed out? Anything that you think is desperate? Did we get anything wrong? I'm not a history teacher, so it's entirely possible I've missed something. Let's talk about it in the comments. I hope that has proved useful and that's given you something for your essays. Please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.